Welcome back to Enlightenment Online. I'd like to continue our discussion about enlightenment and suffering. But first, I thought I would read you a couple of poems from a collection I wrote some years ago called Tefillin Psalms. And these poems sort of give us examples of different moments on the spiritual path. So, the first one. You enter me with a bit of murmuring air, and I don't know which is more difficult, to be with you or without you. There is a steel in me that insists, a metal hook that catches on my sleeve, a meaning that eludes me, a face that will not face me. But I am compelled toward you like a planet in a gravity well. No mind but falling, no thought but go there. O Lord, reduce my fear. Let me go to my obvious conclusion. I've turned around you all my life, and I know the next here is already here. And then this. You show up with a cake we can eat together, and my mind goes out the window. Thought dies slowly, and it's a difficult death. But then I am free to roam from room to room, until I finally come to the kitchen. There you are, sitting at the table, smiling at me. You hand me a piece of cake, and we smile together, the two of us, eyes rolled upward with sweetness on the tips of our tongues. So, enlightenment and suffering. The first question I'd like to explore is, why do we need to talk about suffering again? Isn't the spiritual path supposed to be about joy and happiness? Well, I will be talking about enlightenment and happiness in the next video. But now we need to talk about the origin of happiness and the connection between suffering and happiness and the spiritual path. We could say that all spiritual work comes from the search for happiness. All beings in this universe are searching for happiness. All sentient beings, and from my point of view, all insentient beings, all of creation itself is looking constantly for how to be happy. It's just that on the material plane, when we find happiness, it is doomed to end. That's just the way the material plane and the way time works on this plane of existence is. So happy events end, holidays end, vacations end, good weather ends, illness sometimes comes, love affairs end, and just the fact of having a life means that it's going to end as well. So happiness on this plane is a temporary affair. When we're young, we don't notice this. It doesn't seem to bother us too much in the excitement of being alive, in the dynamic movement of life. There are other pains that young people go through, but by and large, young people hold in their mind a sense of eventually being happy. There's an image of what this happiness might feel or look like, and I will eventually be happy, is the concept. At first, we try to gain this happiness by having the right clothing, having the right friends, speaking the right way, being part of the right group, and so on, having the right things. And then as we grow up and become adults, we have our adult version of the same thing. But something else comes along with this adult version, which is more and more we become aware of the potential for failure in our program to be eternally happy. We begin to see that we can't control our inner psychological or even physical condition, and we can't control external circumstances, and we find that the happiness that we hoped to have constantly comes and goes, and often disappears for long periods of time. So we begin the spiritual path, if we're lucky, to find out more about this happiness and if there is some sort of happiness that can not come and go, that can stay. And here we come to the crux of the matter. It's possible to talk about a form of the spiritual path that we might call a partial spiritual path. And the purpose of this path is to focus on problems and problem solve, to help us become less neurotic, to solve a problem that is keeping us from enjoying life, and so on. And we need this type of path. All of us need that specific work to help us to have more happiness and contact with life. But if your heart and mind and body have been captured by the great existential questions of life, then that type of path won't satisfy you. What are these great existential questions? Well, my wife made me a list. Separateness, loneliness, physical pain and illness and why they exist, the existence of death. Those are some of the big questions. If what we're after is deep insight, a way to live as part of the entire universe and as part of our own life, not feeling alienated from our own life, if we want to investigate what wholeness actually is, then we have to do that through a discussion about suffering and gain deep insight into what suffering is. In my own path and in observing the paths of my students, I've often noticed that there are two types of suffering. The first we could call primary suffering, and the second we could call secondary suffering. Primary suffering is about life as it is. It's not always palatable, but it's always true. We're born and we die, and in between there are difficulties. There's illness, there's loneliness, all these big questions come up. There's neuroses as well. We might call this type of suffering existential suffering because all beings are heir to it. Everybody who comes into incarnation goes through that level of suffering. To our unhealed or uneducated egos, our unintegrated egos, this level of suffering feels like it's too much to bear. And in fact, as children, it might have been too much to bear. But the ego doesn't realize that it's no longer a child. It still has the same protective mechanisms in play. So it creates secondary suffering. It creates secondary suffering to protect itself from suffering. This is an amazing piece of logic that works for a while, but also separates us from life more and more, and actually increases our suffering. So secondary suffering is neurotic suffering, which we create in order to not suffer. And we feel that this other suffering, this primary suffering, is lurking beneath the appearance of everything, and we do what we can to avoid that. So, for example, we overeat, or we overwork, despite the fact that we want to have contact with our families and friends. We become workaholics. Or we find ourselves inexplicably lazy for some reason, or resistant to pleasure. That's a good one. Or we have sexual inhibitions instead of having access to the full spectrum of sexual pleasure and life force. We discover an inability to relax. That's something that I deal with a lot of the time. We discover we have tension in our body and frozenness in our body. These are all secondary sufferings that we create in order to hide the strata of primary sufferings. So it's natural for us to hope to heal ourselves of our suffering by entering the spiritual path. But because we don't differentiate between primary and secondary suffering, we never realize that the more we heal our neurotic suffering, which is something that happens along the spiritual path as well, the more primary suffering will shine through. In other words, the more we heal ourselves of our secondary suffering, the more contact we're going to have with our primary suffering. This is going to cause some nervous moments on the spiritual path unless we understand that it's actually a level of attainment to actually be able to tolerate getting in touch with a level of primary suffering. So what's happening on the spiritual path is that we're getting in touch with wholeness, the wholeness of our suffering, in this particular case, our secondary suffering and our primary suffering, which means that if we walk the spiritual path, we're going to become enlightened as to our delusions. We're going to wake up to where we are imperfect. We're going to wake up to our neuroses. This is not going backwards on the path. This is actually going forward on the path. And long before these things subside in us, the spiritual path is going to bring us face to face with both our neurotic suffering, which we create, and the universal suffering, which we are born into. This is a very, very good thing and will bring us joy. It's not going to bring us the joy of an innocent child who has never gone through anything, but it's going to bring us something much more important. The joy that's not dependent upon outer circumstances, but resides in our open-heartedness toward reality as it is. As I've said before, when we are open-hearted to our true self, just as it is, we find that the existential suffering we encounter is always life-affirming. This is counterintuitive to the ego that's trying to protect us from noticing our primary suffering. But when we actually can make our way through and feel our primary suffering, it is always, without exception, life-enhancing. It's that contact that puts us into contact with all of humanity and brings us to the true mystery of our existence, our relationship and connection to all things in this mysterious, terrible, awful, wonderful, and beautiful world. Finally, in a sutra that I love very much called the Flower Ornament Sutra, there's a wonderful, wonderful paragraph. Here's what it says. Buddhas are beings who are greatly enlightened about their delusions, while ordinary beings are greatly deluded about their enlightenment. So says the sutra, and so says me. And it's what our hearts truly are after, and what we have wanted all of this time.